What's the dumbest school rule that almost got someone killed? Our school had this policy where students couldn't carry any medication on campus, not even an inhaler or EpiPen, because the administration was paranoid about kids selling prescription pills. Everything had to be locked in the nurse's office, and you needed written permission plus a hall pass to access your own life-saving medicine. My name is Liam Kovash, and I'm a senior at Westfield Academy, where following the rules mattered more than common sense until the day my best friend almost died in the middle of gym class. The medication policy got implemented my sophomore year after some kid got caught with his mom's pain pills, and the principal decided the solution was banning everything medical from student possession. They sent home these bright yellow forms requiring parents to sign off on having medications stored in the nurse's office with detailed instructions about dosage and timing. The nurse would dispense one dose at the scheduled time, and if you needed it outside those hours, you had to get teacher approval first, then walk to the main building, then wait for the nurse to verify your identity and check her log before she'd unlock the cabinet. The whole process took at least 15 minutes if you were lucky, and the nurse wasn't dealing with someone else. My best friend Devin had severe allergies to bee stings, the kind where his throat would close up within minutes if he got stung. He'd carried an EpiPen in his backpack since elementary school, and his parents had taught him how to use it when he was 7 years old after a wasp sting at a birthday party nearly killed him. The school's new policy meant he had to surrender both his EpiPens to the nurse on the first day of sophomore year, signing a form that acknowledged he understood the rules. His mom argued with the principal for an hour, explaining that anaphylaxis doesn't wait for permission slips and hall passes, but Principal Garrison stood firm, saying exceptions would undermine the entire policy. He actually said those words while Devin's mom showed him photos of her son's face, swollen like a balloon from his last reaction. Devin adapted by avoiding anywhere bees might be during school hours, eating lunch inside instead of at the outdoor tables, skipping the garden club he'd loved freshman year, and always checking for nests before PE started outside. He kept his phone charged so he could call for help if needed, though our school also had a no phones during class policy that teachers enforced religiously. For 2 years, he managed to avoid any stings through careful vigilance and a lot of anxiety about being outside during the school day. September of our senior year started hot, the kind of oppressive heat that made the classroom air conditioners struggle and turned the gym into a sauna by third period. Our PE teacher, Coach Drummond, decided we'd spend the week doing track and field events on the football field since being cooped up inside was making everyone restless. Devin mentioned his allergy situation to Coach Drummond before class started, explaining he needed to stay aware of bees and might need to go inside quickly if he saw any near him. Coach nodded and said he'd keep an eye out, then blew his whistle to start warm-up laps around the track. The football field backed up to a wooded area that separated our school from the neighborhood behind it, and someone had apparently dumped an old couch in those woods over the summer. Yellow Jackets had built a massive nest inside the couch cushions, hidden from view, but close enough to the field that they'd occasionally fly out to investigate when we got too loud during practice. I noticed them a few times during our warm-up, watching the yellow and black bodies hover near the edge of the woods, but they never came close enough to worry about. Coach Drummond split us into groups for different events, and Devin ended up in the long jump pit with 5 other guys while I got assigned to shot put on the opposite side of the field. The long jump pit was right near the tree line, maybe 30 feet from where that couch was rotting in the underbrush. Around 10:30, the temperature hit 90 degrees, and someone's water bottle fell over near the pit, spilling sugary Gatorade across the sand. Within minutes, Yellow Jackets started showing up, attracted by the sweetness and the disturbance to their territory from all the students running and jumping nearby. Devin saw them first and backed away from the pit, telling Coach Drummond there were Yellow Jackets swarming and he needed to go inside immediately. Coach looked at the insects, counted maybe 5 or 6, and told Devin to just move to a different event instead of disrupting class. Devin tried explaining about his allergy, but Coach interrupted saying he'd already mentioned it earlier and these were just a few bugs, not a crisis. The other guys in the group started waving their arms to shoo the Yellow Jackets away, which only made more of them emerge from the woods, angry at the perceived threat to their nest. I was standing 60 yards away practicing my shot put form when I heard Devin yelling, his voice carrying across the field with real panic in it. I turned to see him running toward the main building with Coach Drummond chasing after him, blowing his whistle and shouting for him to stop. At least 20 Yellow Jackets were following Devin in an angry cloud, and even from that distance I could see him swatting at his neck and arms. He made it about halfway to the building before one got him on the side of his throat, and he stumbled and went down on the grass. Coach Drummond reached him maybe 10 seconds later, and I started running toward them, dropping my shot put and sprinting faster than I'd ever run in my life. By the time I got there, Devin's neck was already swelling, and his breathing sounded wrong, like he was sucking air through a straw. His hands were at his throat, eyes wide with terror, and Coach Drummond was on his radio calling for the nurse to bring the EpiPen to the football field immediately. I knelt next to Devin and watched his lips turning blue while his fingers clawed at his collar, trying to get more air into his closing throat. The nurse's office was in the main building, a 3-minute walk under normal circumstances, but she had to unlock the medication cabinet, locate Devin's EpiPen, lock everything back up per protocol, then cross the courtyard and walk the length of the football field to reach us. Coach kept Devin sitting upright while I held his hand, feeling his pulse racing under my fingers like a trapped bird. His face was turning red and puffy, his eyes starting to swell shut, and the wheezing got quieter as his airway constricted further. Other students had gathered in a circle around us, some filming on their phones despite the no-phone rule, others just staring in shock as Devin literally suffocated in front of them. I kept saying the nurse was coming, help was coming, just hold on, but I could see him fading. His grip on my hand got weaker, and his head lolled to the side like he didn't have the strength to hold it up anymore. 4 minutes had passed since the sting, and the nurse still hadn't appeared from the main building. Coach Drummond made a decision that probably saved Devin's life, and definitely cost him his job. He grabbed Devin's phone from his pocket, dialed 911, and told the operator his student was dying from anaphylaxis, and to send paramedics immediately to the football field at Westfield Academy. The operator asked if an EpiPen was available, and Coach said yes, but it was locked in the nurse's office, and the student couldn't breathe enough to wait. She told him if he could access an EpiPen, he should administer it now, that seconds mattered with anaphylaxis. Coach asked me if I knew where any other student might have one, and I remembered that Kayla in our grade had severe peanut allergies and had mentioned keeping an EpiPen in her backpack, despite the rules. I shouted her name across the field, and she came running with her backpack already open, pulling out the orange and clear tube with shaking hands. She thrust it at Coach Drummond, who pulled off the blue cap and jabbed it into Devin's outer thigh through his gym shorts, holding it there for the required 10 seconds while Devin's body jerked from the epinephrine hitting his system. The effect wasn't immediate like in movies, but after maybe 30 seconds, Devin gasped and managed to pull in a thin breath, then another. His color started coming back from that awful grayish blue to just red and swollen. Coach kept the EpiPen pressed against his leg, talking to him steadily about breathing slowly and staying calm. The nurse finally appeared, running across the field with Devin's official EpiPen in one hand and her first aid kit in the other. She slid to her knees next to us, saw the used EpiPen on the ground, and her face went white. She asked who administered it, and Coach said he did because the student was dying and couldn't wait. She started to say something about protocol, but the ambulance sirens cut her off, growing louder as they approached the school. Paramedics came through the access gate with their equipment, immediately taking over Devin's care. They put an oxygen mask on his face, started an IV line, and loaded him onto a stretcher within minutes. One paramedic picked up the used EpiPen and asked how long between the sting and the injection, and I told him about 6 minutes. He nodded and said that was cutting it close, that another minute or two, and we'd be having a very different conversation. They took Devin to the hospital with lights and sirens going, and Coach Drummond rode along to give a statement to the doctors about what happened. The nurse stood there in the middle of the football field, holding Devin's unused EpiPen, looking lost and scared. Principal Garrison appeared like he'd materialized from thin air, demanding to know why students had phones out and who had given Coach permission to use an unauthorized EpiPen on a student. Several kids started talking at once, trying to explain that Devin was dying, but the principal held up his hand for silence. He told everyone to return to the locker rooms and change. That class was over for the day. Then he turned to Kayla and told her to come with him to his office, because she'd be facing disciplinary action for bringing prohibited medication to school. I grabbed Kayla's arm and said I was coming too, that she'd just helped save Devin's life. Principal Garrison's face turned red, and he said I could join her since I'd apparently participated in violating school policy as well. We sat in the principal's office while he paced behind his desk, going on about rules existing for everyone's safety and how we couldn't just decide which policies to follow based on circumstances. He said the proper protocol was to wait for the nurse to arrive with the registered EpiPen, that using an unauthorized medication opened the school to massive liability if something had gone wrong. Kayla pointed out that Devin was literally dying, and the principal said that's what the emergency response system was for, that we should have trusted the process. I asked if he'd rather explain to Devin's parents why we let their son suffocate while his medication sat locked in a cabinet, and Principal Garrison told me to watch my tone. He pulled out 2 yellow disciplinary forms and started filling them out, one for Kayla possessing prohibited medication, and one for me for participating in unauthorized medical intervention. I couldn't believe this was happening, that we were being punished for saving our friend's life, but the principal seemed more concerned about liability and policy violations than the fact that Devin was breathing because we'd broken his stupid rules. The assistant principal knocked and entered. whispering something in Principal Garrison's ear that made his already red face turn almost purple. Apparently, several parents had called after their kids texted them about what happened on the field, and those parents were demanding answers about why a student with known severe allergies wasn't allowed to carry his own EpiPen. The local news had also gotten wind of the story and was already setting up cameras in the parking lot, asking to speak with administration about the school's medication policy. Principal Garrison dismissed us with a warning that our disciplinary hearings would be scheduled for later that week, then rushed out to deal with the media situation that was unfolding faster than he could control. Kayla and I walked back to the locker rooms in silence, both of us still shaking from the adrenaline and the surreal experience of being threatened with suspension for doing the right thing. Coach Drummond's truck was still in the parking lot, but he hadn't returned from the hospital yet, and I wondered what kind of trouble he was facing for using Kayla's EpiPen instead of waiting for the official one. My phone buzzed with a text from Devin's mom saying he was stable and would be okay, that the doctors said the epinephrine had prevented complete airway closure and probably saved his life. She was beyond grateful and wanted to thank everyone who'd helped, but she was also furious with the school for creating a situation where students had to risk punishment to access life-saving medication. By the time I got home that afternoon, our local news was running the story with the headline, "Student Nearly Dies While Medication Locked Away," and showing footage of our school building. My parents had already seen it and wanted to know everything that happened. I spent an hour explaining the whole situation while my dad got progressively angrier, muttering about incompetent administrators and asking if they'd learned nothing from similar cases that had made national news. My mom called Devin's mom to offer support, and I could hear them both crying on the phone about how close we'd come to planning a funeral instead of celebrating a recovery. The next morning, I arrived at school to find news vans parked along the street and reporters interviewing anyone willing to talk. Students were wearing homemade shirts that said, "Let Devin breathe," and someone had started an online petition to change the medication policy that already had over 2,000 signatures. Principal Garrison sent an email before first period announcing that all medication policies would be under review and asking everyone to respect student privacy during this difficult time. The email carefully avoided mentioning Devin by name or admitting any fault, just expressing concern for student well-being and commitment to safety. Kayla showed up to school expecting to be called down for her disciplinary hearing, but nothing happened. No announcements, no summons to the office, just a normal day of classes while the media circus continued outside. We found out later that the district's legal counsel had advised against any disciplinary action given the circumstances and public attention, that punishing students for saving a life would be a PR nightmare and potential lawsuit. Coach Drummond wasn't so lucky. He returned to school on Thursday, but by Friday, he'd been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his decision to use unauthorized medication on a student. The official reason given was that he'd violated protocol and exposed the district to liability, though everyone knew he was being sacrificed to protect the administration from criticism over their policy. Students started organizing walkouts and protests, planning to flood the next school board meeting with demands for Coach's reinstatement and policy changes. I spent my evenings helping draft a statement about what actually happened that day, working with Kayla and several other students who'd witnessed everything to create a detailed timeline showing how the system had failed. Devin came back to school the following Monday, still puffy and covered in hives, but alive and determined to make sure nobody else faced the same situation. His parents had hired a lawyer and were demanding meetings with the superintendent, armed with medical records and expert testimony about anaphylaxis response times. The first school board meeting after the incident packed the auditorium with parents, students, and community members who'd seen the news coverage. Devin's mom stood at the microphone during public comment and described watching the clock tick by while her son's medication sat locked away, her voice breaking as she explained that 6 minutes was an eternity when someone couldn't breathe. She held up the hospital records showing he'd been maybe 90 seconds from cardiac arrest when the epinephrine finally hit his system. Other parents shared stories of their own kids with allergies and asthma who'd been forced to surrender emergency medications, living in constant fear that they'd have an attack without access to treatment. One father talked about his daughter having an asthma attack during class, and the teacher refusing to let her go to the nurse without finishing her test first, saying policy required students to complete assessments unless there was a documented emergency. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, occasionally glancing at Principal Garrison, who sat in the front row looking like he wanted to disappear. Several medical professionals spoke during the public comment section, including an emergency room doctor who explained in graphic detail what happens during anaphylaxis and why every second matters. She showed slides of airways closing, blood pressure dropping, and organs shutting down, making several board members visibly uncomfortable as they looked at the medical reality behind their policy. An allergist testified that the 15-minute protocol for accessing locked medication was medically untenable for severe allergic reactions, that patients needed epinephrine within minutes to prevent permanent damage or death. A school nurse from a neighboring district described their policy of allowing students with documented severe allergies to carry emergency medications, explaining they'd had 0 incidents of misuse in 15 years. The evidence mounted throughout the 2-hour meeting while the board took notes and avoided making eye contact with the angry crowd. Why is this board acting like they need weeks to figure out what every medical professional in the room just told them in plain English? Makes me wonder if they're more worried about admitting they were wrong than fixing a policy that almost killed someone. There's something really suspicious about administrators who care more about covering their liability than keeping kids safe. The board president finally spoke after public comment ended, announcing they'd form a committee to review all medication policies and report back with recommendations within 30 days. The crowd erupted with angry shouts about committees and delays, with multiple people pointing out that 30 days was too long when students were at risk right now. Devon's father stood up and said his son wouldn't be returning to Westfield until the policy changed, that he refused to send his kid somewhere that prioritized paperwork over survival. 3 other parents immediately agreed, saying they were pulling their children out too. The board president tried to calm everyone down, promising they took these concerns seriously, but his words rang hollow after everything that had happened. The meeting ended with no concrete action, just vague promises about reviewing procedures and ensuring student safety through careful consideration of all stakeholder perspectives. Coach Drummond's administrative leave turned into a formal termination hearing 2 weeks later, held in a closed session that students and parents weren't allowed to attend. His union representative argued that he'd acted reasonably under emergency circumstances, that any rational person would have prioritized saving a life over following protocol. The district countered that he'd violated clear policy and created liability exposure by using unauthorized medication, that the proper action was to wait for the official EpiPen, regardless of the student's condition. They brought in a lawyer who droned on about duty of care and standard procedures, while completely ignoring the fact that Devon would be dead if Coach had followed their rules. The hearing lasted 3 hours, and at the end, the board voted to terminate Coach Drummond's employment, effective immediately for gross violation of district medication policy. They offered him a deal where if he resigned voluntarily, they'd keep the termination off his record and provide a neutral reference, but he refused, saying he wouldn't pretend he'd done something wrong by saving a student's life. The news of Coach's firing spread through school the next morning, and by lunch, over 300 students had walked out in protest. We gathered on the front lawn with signs saying, "Coach did nothing wrong," and "Fire the policy, not the hero," while news cameras captured everything. Several teachers joined us, including our biology teacher, who gave an impromptu lesson about anaphylaxis and why the medication policy was medically indefensible. Parents started arriving to support the walkout, and someone set up a GoFundMe to help Coach with legal expenses that raised $10,000 in the first day. The superintendent issued a statement calling the walkout disruptive and asking students to return to class, warning that continued absence could result in disciplinary action. Nobody moved. We stayed on that lawn for 4 hours, while the administration scrambled to figure out how to handle a student body that had collectively decided their policies were more dangerous than breaking them. Devon's lawyer filed a formal complaint with the state education department about the medication policy, attaching medical records, witness statements, and expert testimony about the dangers of delaying emergency medication access. The complaint outlined multiple violations of disability accommodation laws, arguing that students with severe allergies were being denied equal access to education by forcing them to choose between following policy and staying alive. Within a week, the state launched an investigation into Westfield's medication procedures, sending inspectors to review all policies and interview staff about implementation. The district suddenly became very cooperative about policy changes, announcing an immediate interim measure allowing students with life-threatening conditions to carry emergency medications with proper documentation. Principal Garrison sent an email taking credit for this decisive action to protect student safety, never once acknowledging that it was the exact change parents and medical professionals had been demanding for 3 years. The policy change came too late to help Coach Drummond, who'd already been fired and was fighting to get unemployment benefits, while the district claimed he was terminated for cause. His union filed a grievance arguing wrongful termination, that he'd been punished for saving a life while following reasonable emergency protocols. The case dragged through arbitration for months, while Coach survived on savings and substitute teaching jobs at other districts. Students kept up pressure with letter-writing campaigns and continued protests at board meetings, refusing to let the administration sweep everything under the rug. Devon became the face of the movement, speaking at other schools about medication access rights and working with advocacy groups to push for legislation requiring reasonable emergency policies. His near-death experience had transformed him from a quiet kid trying to avoid bees into an activist determined to prevent others from facing the same preventable crisis. 6 months after the incident, the arbitrator ruled in Coach Drummond's favor, finding that his termination was unjust given the emergency circumstances and that the district's medication policy had created an unreasonable and dangerous situation. Coach was reinstated with back pay and a formal apology from the board, though several members voted against it and made statements about sending the wrong message about following rules. The students who'd supported him throughout erupted in celebration when the decision was announced, and Coach returned to school the following week to a standing ovation from the entire gym class. He seemed older somehow, worn down by the months of legal battles and uncertainty, but grateful to be back doing what he loved. His first day back, he gathered us on the football field and gave a speech about how sometimes doing the right thing means breaking bad rules, that we should never let policy override basic humanity and common sense. The football field where it all happened looked the same, but someone had finally dealt with that yellow jacket nest in the abandoned couch, removing the whole thing and filling in the area where it had been. The long jump pit got moved to the other side of the field, away from the tree line, and Coach instituted a new policy where any student could immediately go inside if they felt unsafe outside, no questions asked. Devin still got nervous around bees, but he carried his EpiPen in his pocket now, exactly where it should have been all along. Kayla kept hers too, and several other students with allergies started carrying their medications openly, daring anyone to challenge them after everything that had happened. The culture at school shifted from blind rule following to questioning whether policies actually made sense, with students and teachers more willing to push back when something seemed dangerous or wrong. Principal Garrison retired at the end of that school year, though the official announcement called it a long-planned departure and thanked him for his years of service. Everyone knew he'd been pushed out after the medication policy disaster and the negative attention it brought the district. The new principal started her tenure by meeting with parent and student groups about safety concerns, actually listening to feedback instead of dismissing it as not understanding proper procedures. She implemented a medical advisory committee that included doctors, nurses, and parents of students with chronic conditions, giving them direct input on any health-related policies. The change felt revolutionary after years of top-down administration that treated families as problems to be managed rather than partners in education. Devin and I graduated that spring with our class, walking across the stage to get our diplomas while Coach Drummond cheered from the faculty section. We'd all survived a system that tried to prioritize paperwork over people, and in fighting back, we'd actually changed things for the better. During the graduation ceremony, the valedictorian mentioned the medication policy incident in her speech, calling it a wake-up call about questioning authority and standing up for what's right even when it's hard. The audience applauded, and I saw several board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. That night at graduation parties, everyone kept coming back to the same question about what other rules we'd been following blindly that didn't make sense, what other policies put people at risk while administrators worried about liability and control. I think about that day on the football field sometimes, watching Devin's lips turn blue while we waited for permission to save his life. The memory makes me angry all over again at how close we came to losing him over a policy that sounded reasonable in a conference room but became deadly in real life. Coach Drummond lost months of his career and financial security for doing the obviously right thing, and students had to risk punishment to keep their friend alive. The whole situation exposed how systems designed to protect can become instruments of harm when they're implemented without common sense or flexibility. Rules matter, but they should serve people, not the other way around. When a policy requires you to watch someone die while their medication sits locked away, that's not safety or order, it's just bureaucratic cruelty dressed up as procedure. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.